Hello, my name is Melissa Bond, and today I'm presenting my talk on the role of educational technology in fostering student engagement. This talk has been prepared for the Zurich University of Teacher Education webinar series entitled Researching Student Engagement Impulses for Higher Education, and was meant to be presented in late June 2021. Unfortunately, I was unwell and was unable to present at that time. So therefore, today I will be presenting a modified version of this talk for you. And I do thank you and apologise for the delay. This presentation will begin with a brief introduction to my personal and professional background. I will then explain how I approached the conceptualisation of my student engagement framework as part of my PhD by publication, followed by an overview of systematic review methodology, including associated challenges and benefits. I will then explain how I applied my framework within my research in order to further develop and enhance it, as well as to identify gaps in the literature and implications for practice. So first of all, I'd like to give a little bit of information about my background. I was born and raised in South Australia, and I come from traditional Nudgee country. So I was born in Clare, which is about an hour and a half to 2 hours north of Adelaide. And that photo there on the left-hand side is me with my mum and my nephew Zeb at an Australian rules football match supporting the Adelaide Crows. I was a high school teacher for 10 years and I actually taught at the same high school that I attended. Predominantly I taught German, but I also taught humanities, computing, English, drama, music, and a whole range of other subjects. And I was also a curriculum and year-level leader for some years as well. After I did my Masters in Education at the University of Adelaide, I decided that I wanted to fulfill a lifelong dream of living in Germany. And that saw me seek out an opportunity at the University of Oldenburg, which is in the north of Germany. Through an amazing coincidence and sheer luck of finding a suitable position with Professor Dr. ZHE, I managed to secure a position at the university and was there as a research associate within the Active Learn project from 2017 until 2020. During this time, I undertook my PhD, which was entitled Facilitating Student Engagement Through Educational Technology, Current Research Practices and Perspectives. Now, I was incredibly lucky to have this position, and you can see the photo there at the bottom is my daughter looking out at the North Sea, which I think was in Wilhelmshaven. Following on from that position, I then made yet another international move to England. And I currently live in Northamptonshire, indicated by the red star on the map of England there. And that's, again, about 2 hours north of London. So I work predominantly as a support officer for the evidence synthesis software Epi Reviewer, which is based at the Epi Centre at University College London. And I moved here in February 2020, just before the very first lockdown. So I only managed to experience about 3 weeks of working with my colleagues at the university. And I went to South Africa for a week to give a workshop. When I came back, basically everyone was in lockdown situation, and unfortunately I haven't been back in the office since. So I've been home working now for quite a long time. So predominantly my role is to support people and researchers using Epi Reviewer to undertake a variety of different reviews. But I've also been conducting my own systematic and mapping reviews as well. And one of those particular areas in particular during this time has been the research that's been undertaken on teaching and learning during the pandemic. And I also provide methodological support for people doing their reviews. I am now facing yet another sea change, although back to my roots, and I am going to be, from November of this year, as long as I can get into the country, I'm going to be taking up a position as a lecturer in digital technology education at the University of South Australia. And the University of South Australia has 3 campuses in South Australia, and they are on Kaurna, Bwandik and Bangala First Nations country. I'm very, very excited and really looking forward to that next challenge. So as we heard in Ella Kahu's talk in the first webinar of this series, student engagement is a multifaceted and complex construct that has been represented in a myriad of ways, but something that is so vital to understanding and of course enhancing the student learning experience. Some people have described it as like a black box, a catch-all term. They've said it suffers from indigestion. Another said it was one of the most widely used and overgeneralized constructs found in the educational, learning, instructional and psychological sciences. And perhaps my personal favourite, that it's like 3 blind men describing an elephant. When I first started my PhD and the Active Learn project at the University of Oldenburg, Ella Kahu's student engagement framework for higher education was my primary starting point. I was interested in developing a framework that might work in part for both K-12, so schooling, and higher education, and I was particularly drawn to how this diagram illustrated that reciprocal flow of influences on and consequences or outcomes of engagement. However, I found that there needed to be more consideration of the important role that technology now plays, as well as the multiple interactions that occur, particularly within a blended or online classroom. Previous research has shown that using technology in the classroom can lead to improved self-regulation and self-efficacy, increased participation and involvement, as well as increased involvement within the wider educational community. However, educational technology research has traditionally lacked theoretical guidance, including a limited use of theoretical frameworks. As with other disciplines, the definitions and operationalizations of student engagement have also widely differed, which has further inhibited our understanding and therefore application to practice. In order to address this issue, I undertook a PhD by publication. This means that instead of undertaking one study and writing one large book about it, I undertook several studies, published multiple journal articles, and then weaved them together into one overarching document, synthesizing the results. My PhD started from a macro overview, narrowing down to more micro concerns, and sought to answer 3 primary research questions. 1. What are the central research topics and issues related to educational technology? 2. How can educational technology affect and support student engagement? And 3. How can the flipped learning approach affect and support student engagement in the K-12 classroom? In order to do this, I undertook 5 separate studies and articles. The first of these answered research question 1. And this was a qualitative content analysis of the British Journal of Educational Technology across its 50 years of publication, so from 1970 to 2018. The second and third articles answered research question 2 and were focused on a theoretical review and framework development. It used grounded theory and was predominantly focused on the undertaking of a systematic review and then a theoretical article that focused on the development of my conceptual framework. Article 4 answered both research questions 2 and 3 and was a systematic literature review of research looking at flipped learning and student engagement in schools. And the 5th article was purely focusing on research question 3 and was a case study looking at the use of flipped learning in 2 South Australian high schools, and the article itself focused predominantly on both student and parent engagement. The development of my conceptual framework was an iterative process that occurred throughout my PhD and was based on both theoretical and primary and secondary empirical research. I had thought that it would be quite a linear process, but in reality, it was certainly anything but, as each study provided yet further insight into this complex construct. So, theoretical article 1 led into the development of my case study, which then further led into a refinement of the framework development and theoretical article number 2. But then at the same time, I was still writing the article 5, and so that led into that case study, which then also influenced the undertaking and reporting of the systematic review, which was article 4. And so on and so forth. So it was a very cyclical, iterative process. As a result of this process, I then developed the following definition of student engagement. Student engagement is the energy and effort that students employ within their learning community, observable via any number of behavioural, cognitive, or affective indicators across a continuum. It is shaped by a range of structural and internal influences, including the complex interplay of relationships, learning activities, and the learning environment. The more students are engaged and empowered within their learning community, the more likely they are to then channel that energy back into their learning, leading to a range of short and long-term outcomes that can likewise further fuel engagement. And to present that visually, I produced this diagram here. And so here you can see the learning environment, the microsystem of teaching and learning, with the student nested in the centre. And as they are influenced by these range of factors, this leads to a range of affective, cognitive, or behavioural engagement indicators, which can likewise then further fuel and lead into the microsystem, producing further engagement, which can then lead to a range of short and long-term outcomes, which can also then produce further engagement and lead back into the learning community. And so it's, again, as with Ella Kahu's framework, a very cyclical process. However, students aren't only influenced by those immediate microsystem factors. They are, of course, influenced by a wide range of external factors as well. And to visualise this, I adapted the bioecological model of child development by Bronfen, Brenner and colleagues. So we see here the student is nested at the centre of these interconnected layers. So we see here student at the centre of the microsystem, influenced by the use by teachers, by their institution, peers, their family, the curriculum, and the technology that is used to facilitate their learning. This is likewise influenced by a student's socio-economic background and the mesosystem layer, which is also influenced by the exosystem, and that includes institutional staffing policies, professional development policies and funding. Also included within this layer is the wider community, social services, a student's employment, their family networks, and any extracurricular activities that they're engaged with, whether there's a national curriculum influencing what students learn. At the schooling level, feeder schools where the students attend primary school at a range of different primary schools, and then the students at Year 7 go into one combined high school. And then you have the macro system on the outer layer, and this includes things like digitalisation, whether there is infrastructure available at the wider level, the influence of national policies, and the overarching political and social environment. Based on a synthesis of primary and secondary research, I identified the following internal and external influences on student engagement within the microsystem. In terms of students' internal influences, this includes things like their interest for a subject or for a particular topic, a student's identity, but also crucially their computing skills and knowledge, their acceptance of technology, and their prior experiences with ICT. This includes things such as whether students have been exposed to or used certain technologies before, and whether there have been any negative experiences in particular that might influence how well they would approach using technology again in the future. In terms of the influences on engagement from teachers, this includes things like the level of feedback and support that they provide, their presence within the classroom, and as with students, also with teachers, their ICT skills and knowledge, their acceptance of technology, the use of technology that they employ within their teaching, and of course their prior ICT experience as well. Also coming into play is their level of content expertise, the professional development that they're involved with or that they undertake, and in particular as it refers to technology, as well as the professional networks that teachers become involved with and connect with in terms of developing their own pedagogy and their technological knowledge. Influences from the learning environment and technology itself include, of course, students' access to technology, but also the usability and design of the technology itself and the accessibility of the learning environment as well. Technology choice also plays a particularly important part, and a lot of studies show that where students have been given the option to choose the technology that is used within a course, that can actually enhance engagement. Developing a sense of community within a classroom is particularly important, especially in terms of blended and online learning. Online assessment tools have also been found particularly engaging, as well as ensuring that students have access to opportunities to collaborate with others. And so therefore the use of collaborative tools such as Google Docs or wikis, for example, provides students with that opportunity. Something else that's also been found incredibly important is the content length of videos, particularly in terms of the flipped learning approach. And so keeping those videos shorter, and a lot of studies say between 4 to 7 minutes and certainly no longer than 10 minutes is ideal. In terms of curriculum and activities, the quality, again, as with the learning environment and technology, the quality and design of activities is really important, and especially ensuring that those activities are aligned to the learning outcomes that you're wanting from a particular course, but also that they're useful and provide authentic learning experiences and are relevant to students and what they're learning. In terms of familial influences on student engagement, we again find that their ICT skills and knowledge, their acceptance of technology, and their prior ICT experience is particularly important and influential when it comes to then supporting students and their learning at home. Things that have also been found crucial in terms of influencing student engagement is the level to which families engage with the content that students are learning, and also the development, the both professional and personal level that families have gone through, in particular parents have gone through, in terms of understanding the types of technology that students are using. Peers have been found to be particularly influential, and so the providing those opportunities to collaborate with peers is really important, but also establishing respectful relationships and understanding the boundaries and expectations that come with peer-to-peer learning. It's also been found important that students are able to see each other, especially in online environments, and that they're given opportunities to respond to the work of others and to share their ideas with other students. And one way that they can do that is to co-create learning materials together. Within each of the three widely accepted domains of engagement of behavioural, affective and cognitive, a range of facets or indicators have been identified. And so these include, for example, under behavioural engagement, effort, time on task, and study habits that students have, but also things like positive conduct and action initiation, asking their teacher or peers for help. So these are particularly things that are quite visible in terms of what can be observable and what can be measured. Effective engagement indicators include things like enthusiasm, a sense of well-being, a desire to do well, enjoyment, and so on. And cognitive engagement indicators include things like critical thinking, self-regulation, setting learning goals, reflection, and focus. Facets of disengagement include absence, poor conduct, restlessness, being distracted. Effective disengagement include things like being dissatisfied with, for example, learning online as opposed to face-to-face. Perhaps frustration in terms of when technology isn't working properly, but also cognitive disengagement in terms of being unfocused or inattentive, opposing a particular approach, or avoiding work altogether. So those facets of engagement and disengagement were used to code studies in the 2 systematic reviews that I conducted in my PhD of research exploring student engagement and technology. Systematic reviews are literature reviews that are conducted using explicit and transparent methods. They are reported in such a way that they provide an exact recipe to other researchers to be able to produce similar results or to be able to update the review in the future. Evidence syntheses are important as they allow us to explore a body of evidence across a range of studies and contexts rather than looking at any one study by itself. There are a range of different types of evidence synthesis, and the type of review that's conducted really depends upon a number of factors, including the amount of time and money you have to spend on doing the review. So in this case, both of these were full systematic reviews. For those unfamiliar with the process, systematic reviews start off with identifying a review question or questions, as well as the conceptual framework that will be used to guide the review, including any coding and data extraction. You then identify the search strategy, and this includes coming up with a search string that you're going to use in each of the databases that you're searching, defining which databases they're going to be that you're going to search in, as well as the selection criteria for studies that will be included in your review. Once you've identified those studies, you would then screen all of them on their titles and abstracts. For the ones that have been identified as included on title and abstract, you would then retrieve them and get all of the PDFs and upload them into your software. You would then screen all of those studies that have been included to that point on their full text. So that means reading through all of the PDFs to see whether or not they should be included in your review. Once you've gotten to that point, the items that you have identified that should be included on full text are then coded, and this is a method called data extraction. And so here you would be extracting all of the data that you would need in order to answer your review questions. You would then conduct quality assessment on those studies that you've included. You would then conduct data analysis and synthesis of all of the results of the studies in your systematic review. And you would then report your findings, preferably following the PRISMA guidelines. So there are many challenges, though, when conducting systematic reviews. And these include, first of all, understanding the method, because it's not like conducting a normal literature review where you would simply locate a certain number of studies and then you would synthesize those. It really is a particular method that follows, certain steps and does require a level of understanding. Another challenge is identifying appropriate software and then managing all of the data that's involved. Another challenge is the scope and retrieval, and often this comes down to starting off with a particular idea in mind, but then as you go along, realizing that perhaps you've tried to include all of the studies that have ever been published on a particular topic, but this inevitably ends up in identifying a huge number of studies. And that obviously has a particular a time cost involved with it. And so then you'd need to think about, narrowing down the scope perhaps to a particular a number of years, or a particular level of study. For example, focusing just on higher education, or even focusing just on undergraduates as opposed to both undergraduates and postgraduates. There's also the issue in terms of retrieval with getting a copy of those studies, because of course there are a number of studies that are behind paywalls and that perhaps your institution doesn't have access to. And so it becomes a matter of, trying to find different repositories that allow you access to those studies. That may also involve you having to contact the authors of studies that you haven't been able to locate and seeing if you can get a copy from them. Inevitably, though, in most reviews, you'll find that there are a handful that you're simply unable to get a hold of. And as I've already mentioned, one of the major challenges is that of resourcing. And that's just not only the amount of time that you might have allocated to conduct a particular review, but that also refers to people and manpower, and having access to enough people that are able to conduct the review in a timely manner. Having said that, there are, of course, a lot of benefits to conducting systematic reviews. And I think especially the first one that I have listed here, the development of search and retrieval skills, is absolutely a brilliant benefit of learning how to conduct systematic reviews, and I think is one major reason why not only postgraduate students should learn how to use this methodology, but also undergraduates would benefit greatly from learning how to do systematic reviews. Through doing them, you're also exposed to a range of research and writing styles. And I honestly think that's one of the ways that I learned how to write academic journal articles myself, was through having to read through so many different articles when undertaking my systematic reviews. You're also then, of course, exposed to a number of different journal styles as well. Through doing your systematic reviews, you gain a broad understanding of a particular topic and can then identify where the gaps are in the research. And that can then help you with your future research planning and also help other researchers, of course. So the first systematic review that I conducted as part of my PhD was part of the Active Learn project, which was a collaboration between the University of Oldenburg and the University of Duisburg-Essen. The research questions we sought to answer were: how do the studies in the sample ground student engagement and align with theory? Which indicators of cognitive, behavioural and affective engagement were identified in studies where educational technology was used? And which indicators of student disengagement? And what are the learning scenarios, modes of delivery and educational technology tools employed in the studies? To answer the research questions, we developed a rather comprehensive search string, which you can find in our article on page 8. It included terms related to students and learning, combined with terms related to higher education, as well as many terms related to educational technology. We deliberately decided not to search for terms related to student engagement specifically, given the wide range of ways that it has been conceptualised in the literature. In hindsight, we would have limited the number of technology terms used, and we would have kept search strings slightly shorter. And this is something we've actually done in reviews that we've conducted since then. We chose to search in 4 databases, namely ERIC, Web of Science, Scopus and PsycInfo, because these have been found to be appropriate and comprehensive in other systematic reviews that have been conducted. And we made sure that we kept a detailed record of the results for each search. Our inclusion criteria for studies to be included in this particular review, we initially had kept the years broad, and so we ended up with an enormous amount of literature that came back from our searches. So we decided to narrow the scope so that it was more manageable, and we decided to narrow it to 2007 to 2016. And of course, we were focusing on higher education. We chose to include research that was only conducted in English, and that was focused on teaching and learning. We also decided to only include peer-reviewed literature as, we were under time constraints, and there is a level of rigour and quality appraisal that goes into the peer review process, of course. We also chose to only include primary empirical research, and obviously only that which was focused on educational technology, and research that was looking into student engagement. Now, as I said, initially we didn't look at including student engagement terms within our search string, but when we conducted our first search, we ended up getting almost 80,000 studies. And so part of the decision that happened before the screening process was to use the framework and the facets of engagement and disengagement that I showed you just earlier to narrow down the studies that we were going to include for screening on title and abstract. And by doing that, as well as narrowing the scope to those 10 years, we came down to 18,000 studies to screen. Now we had, this was quite a large project, and we had funding for a couple of years. So we were incredibly lucky. We also had a team of 3 research associates who were actively working on this screening. So whilst 18,000 studies sounds like a lot, we did have the resources to be able to manage that. Had we not have had so many people, and had we have had less time, which is often the case in time-pressured projects, and then obviously we would have needed to have narrowed the scope even further. Following screening on title and abstract, we came to 4,152 items that we identified that should be included. This was still too many, and so we decided to conduct a sampling, which you can read about in our article, and that led to 349 studies being screened on full text, which is obviously a far more manageable number. We also did quality appraisal on those 349 studies, and following those steps, we ended up with a pot of 243 studies to extract data from and to conduct our synthesis. So, what did we find? We found that almost all of the studies lacked a definition of student engagement. So even though they were focused on student engagement with technology or as a result of using technology, we found that 93% of those studies didn't actually include or identify how they were going about understanding student engagement at all, which is really quite high. We did find, though, evidence of at least one dimension of engagement, which is based on that framework that you saw, in 94% of studies. We found behavioural engagement to have the highest prevalence, which was 86%. However, of course, those facets of behavioural engagement are also the ones that are more visible, perhaps more observable, more measurable, and so that may explain the not only the fact that we found more than the other 2 domains, but the fact that perhaps they've also been researched more often. Effective engagement was found the second most prevalent at 67%, followed by cognitive engagement at 56%. The top 5 engagement indicators across all of the 243 studies were participation involvement, which was identified in 49% of those studies, followed closely by achievement, which I should say of itself isn't necessarily an indicator of engagement, but rather an outcome. But this is something I've actually since sort of changed my mind on in further iterations of using my framework. This was followed by positive interaction with teachers and peers. And you can see then from 41%, there's quite a bit of a drop to the next indicator, which was enjoyment, and then learning from peers at 22%. The most prevalent disengagement indicators included frustration, opposition rejection, disappointment, feeling pressured, and worry or anxiety. And there was a really huge disparity between the percentage of studies that indicated disengagement indicators as opposed to engagement, which you can see here by the percentages. Across the 243 studies, over 50 individual technology tools were employed. Following a slightly modified version of Bauer's educational tools typology, 17 broad categories of tools were identified. We found that studies using text-based tools, knowledge organisation and sharing tools, and multimodal production tools had the highest proportion of effective, behavioural and cognitive engagement. So text-based tools are things like emails. Knowledge organisation and sharing tools are things like learning management systems, and multimodal production tools are things like teacher-created videos. So as you can see on this table here, in studies where text-based tools were used, 63% of those studies showed effective engagement, 59% behavioural, and 63% cognitive. Interestingly, studies using website creation tools, such as blogs, reported more disengagement than engagement indicators across all three domains, with studies using assessment tools and social networking tools also reporting increased instances of disengagement across two domains. In studies where assessment tools were used, students found timed assessment stressful, particularly when trying to complete complex mathematical solutions. And it should be mentioned that we found a very high prevalence of studies that were researching STEM subjects. And so the number of studies involving mathematical solutions were quite high. As well as quizzes that were given at the end of lectures were also found particularly disengaging because some students preferred having take-up time of content first. The next systematic review that I conducted as part of my PhD was on flipped learning and student engagement in schools, so from K to 12. The research questions I sought to answer were, what are the characteristics and methods used in research on flipped learning and student engagement? How is research on flipped learning theoretically grounded in schooling literature? Which indicators of student engagement and disengagement are affected as a result of using the flipped learning approach? And what technology has been used in applications of flipped learning research, and how is it linked to engagement? So for those people unfamiliar with the term, flipped learning has been touted as a student-centered approach with great promise. The Flipped Learning Network describe it as a framework that enables educators to reach every student. The flipped approach inverts the traditional classroom model by introducing class concepts before class, allowing educators to use class time to guide each student through active, practical, innovative applications of the course principles. And so generally in the traditional version of schooling, you would have the lecture happening and then students would do homework activities afterwards at home. Whereas in the flipped version, students would generally, but not always, watch short videos at home on content prior to coming to class. And then in the classroom, they would be often undertaking collaborative activities in the group space. So in terms of conducting this systematic review, I decided to extend the number of databases that I would search. So as I said in the first review that we conducted, we only looked at those first four, but I decided to include further databases just to make sure that I widened the scope a little bit more. I decided to focus on studies that were conducted between 2012 and 2018. 2018 was when I was conducting this, so I was trying to capture as much up-to-date, up-to-the-minute research as possible. And of course, 2012 was when Bergman and Sams published their first information really about their version of the flipped learning approach. So I chose to focus on schools. So anything from kindergarten up to year 12. Again, I sought to only include studies published in the English language. But I will just mention, of course, that is a massive limitation of both this review and the review that I discussed first. And in one of the current reviews that I have been doing on teaching and learning research conducted in higher education during the pandemic, we actually explicitly searched for studies using a Spanish search string as well, because we had a multilingual group of reviewers. And we also sought to include German language studies as well, although we actually at the time found very little published where we were looking. So I also focused on primary empirical research, studies that used the flipped learning approach and that were focused on student engagement. And again, I did not search for student engagement terms explicitly within the search string. And that was a conscious choice to ensure that all of the different permeations of engagement might be included. When I conducted the first search, I found 949 studies. Which, following removal of duplicates, I was left with 760 to screen on title and abstract. I narrowed this down to 341 studies to screen on full text. However, at the data extraction and quality appraisal stages, I got it down to 118. And then following the quality appraisal, got it down to 107 studies for data extraction and synthesis. As you can see on the screen here, the majority of studies were conducted in North America, followed by Asia, the Middle East, Europe, Oceania, with very little from Africa and the Global South, and none that I located from Central and South America. The year levels that were the most researched, and I should mention, there was a couple of studies that did not mention the year level of students, but they did mention the age levels. But the highest year level that was the most researched was year 9, followed closely by year 11 and year 8. STEM subjects were the most researched, with maths by far the most popular, representing 38% of the studies in the corpus. Shorter studies that focused on one class only dominated, and most of the studies were quantitative in their approach, followed by qualitative and mixed methods. In terms of the technology that was used, videos made by teachers were the most mentioned, followed by self-assessment quizzes and learning management systems. There was evidence of at least one dimension of engagement found in 93% of the studies, which was the same actually as the first review that we conducted. Again, behavioural engagement was the most prevalent, with 81% of studies showing some kind of facet of engagement, followed by affective and cognitive. And it should be noted here that cognitive engagement was found in a much higher number of studies than it was in that higher education review. The top 5 engagement indicators were increased interaction with peers, enjoyment, participation involvement, increased interaction with teachers, and increased confidence. And I think these are, some of the benefits of flipped learning that are mentioned many times. It's that increased involvement and interaction that it can promote, especially when, when those collaborative opportunities are available in the group space. The disengagement indicators, though, were task incompletion, and that often related to students not watching videos, frustration with the approach, an unwillingness to do the work at home or to participate in group activities in class, confusion, and dislike of the approach. In terms of specific types of technology that we used, videos made by others were found to have slightly higher instances of behavioural engagement than videos made by teachers. However, there were more instances of disengagement when videos were made by others than when they were made by the teacher. And it should also be mentioned, of course, that there were far more studies with videos made by teachers than there were by others. Students also reported that when teachers made their own videos, they felt a lot more connected to their teacher, and not just connected to their teacher, but connected to the content as well. And so they found that really engaging. In cases where learning management systems, named learning management systems were used, such as Edmodo, Google Classroom and Moodle, engagement was really quite high as opposed to other learning management systems that were used. And part of the reason for that is the increased collaborative opportunities that some of these learning management systems allow students to have, and really enabled that interaction with peers and the interaction with teachers to occur. The last systematic review that I'd like to talk about is one that we have been conducting during the pandemic on online and blended learning in secondary schools in particular. And the research questions that we sought to answer were, in what ways did emergency remote education affect motivation and engagement in secondary students? How did the research report on emerging online assessment practices? Whether there are any new approaches to peer collaboration emerging and what that suggests? How online learning in secondary schools affects parent engagement? And what emerging uses of online and blended learning approaches in secondary schools could continue to be implemented going forward? Again, we used a systematic review and we focused only on secondary school, as I mentioned. Again, we focused only on English published literature that included the teaching and learning. So any studies that were looking at a broader macro or MESA level approach, we didn't include, and we were really only focusing on that micro system level. We only included studies that looked at online or blended learning approaches, and that were primary empirical research, and of course that were undertaken during the pandemic. The steps again were the same. So the search resulted in just over 6,000 studies, and we screened 5,500 studies on title and abstract. Following that stage, we screened 759 on full text, and that led to 129 studies being coded for data extraction and a quality appraisal, which led to 81 studies being identified for synthesis. And it should be mentioned also that the studies were extracted for data, again, based on the framework and the facets of engagement. So in terms of the study characteristics, most of the research was conducted during the pandemic in Asia, followed by Europe and North America. And as you just heard in terms of the flipped learning studies that were conducted pre-pandemic, that's quite a shift in terms of the geography of these studies. And I think part of the reason for this is due to the nature of the pandemic, the nature of the virus, and where the virus was most prevalent. In terms of wealth of the studies, the majority were undertaken in high-income countries, but there were also 37% of studies that came from either low or lower middle-income countries. Again, unfortunately, there was very few studies from the Global South, although I did identify slightly more studies from Africa than I had previously. And I guess, again, in terms of Oceania in particular, part of the reason there might be the difference in the veracity of the virus itself and how the virus moved throughout the world. In this particular review, we found that self-regulation was actually the top engagement indicator with 26%. Followed by heightened understanding of topics or tasks, enjoyment, positive study habits, and a sense of well-being. So some students were actually reported to be more motivated to learn and complete their schoolwork during the pandemic, with an increased ability to study and a heightened sense of responsibility. And some teachers also reported that some of their more reserved students were found to interact and participate more than they usually would in pre-pandemic times. There were also studies that reported an increased level of attendance and engagement from students who had chronic absenteeism issues. And so that was really quite interesting. In terms of disengagement, though, perhaps unsurprisingly, of course, given the isolation involved with lockdown situations, feeling socially isolated was the top disengagement indicator, and it was really quite high at 27%, followed by teachers reporting students being absent from live lessons, students being confused over the task instructions that they were given, feeling overwhelmed with the amount of work that they had to do, and a dislike of learning online. Teachers reported that they felt both an emotional and a physical distance from students. And it was interesting that there were more instances of behavioural disengagement in studies from high-income countries at 59%, as opposed to behavioural disengagement being reported in lower middle-income countries at 29%. However, it should be noted that live lessons, so synchronous lessons, were far more prevalent in high-income countries as opposed to lower middle-income countries where they use text-based tools more often. And that may explain some of the difference in those percentages. Students also reported having to learn new tools, as well as learning online, being quite overwhelming, and of course the life load that both students and educators were having to deal with during the pandemic as being quite overwhelming. When you compare the flipped learning review that I talked you through just earlier with this particular review, you can see quite a stark difference in the percentages of engagement that were found. Obviously, it's very difficult. You can't really compare the studies like for like, given that these are completely different contexts, completely different studies, but it is interesting to draw some comparisons. I think it's really quite obvious that there was a real lack of interaction between with peers and with teachers. When we compare the disengagement indicators then, it's perhaps quite interesting to see that the percentages aren't all that dissimilar. And so there's that difference in, again, the social isolation being quite high, but that, feelings of frustration and confusion are really quite similar in terms of the frequency that they were reported in these particular studies. We also created what's called an interactive evidence gap map, and there is a link for you to be able to open that and to explore. And actually, I might do that now just to show you. So this interactive evidence gap map was created using data from the EPI Reviewer evidence synthesis software. And this is a freely accessible open map that you're able to look at. And basically it is, in particular, it relates to the motivation and engagement research question. What it shows you here is up here we have the study characteristics with the participant continent, participant focus, technology used, and then down the left we have the outcomes, so the different student engagement domains down the left-hand side. So if I just collapse this, and here's the different types of technology used. And here you can see that synchronous collaboration tools, really unsurprisingly, had the highest level of engagement across all three domains. And synchronous collaboration tools are things like Zoom, any live video lessons that were used, and that was followed closely by knowledge organisation and sharing tools. Again, they're learning management systems, so quite unsurprising that they would be frequently mentioned, but also have engagement indicators. And then multimodal production tools following that. So you are more than welcome to freely explore this tool. And you're also actually able to, if you click on one of the bubbles, you bring up this records page here, and you're able to download the listed references that you have here if you want to. You can also view all of the records and download those onto your as a RIS file onto your device. Okay, in terms of what was found particularly engaging, assessment tools in particular were found quite engaging, and especially the use of quizzes being embedded. And there were instances of those quizzes being embedded at the beginning of lessons to just double check understanding that was done for students during their homework time. But also at the end, of course, just to see whether students had managed to pick up on the concepts that were being discussed during live lessons. Learning management systems, again, that used collaborative tools were particularly engaging. Again, Google Classroom was one that was mentioned quite often. Breakout rooms that provided opportunities for peers to interact, to chat, and were also particularly fantastic for group work, and they were found really engaging as well. Live synchronous lessons, as I mentioned, with those synchronous collaboration tools, but live synchronous lessons that included social time were found quite engaging. So, for example, there were cases where teachers would allow 5 minutes at the beginning and 5 minutes at the end of the lesson, purely to allow the students to connect with each other on a more social level outside of the learning that they were meant to be doing. And also, as found in the Flipped Learning Review, videos that were made by teachers were particularly engaging, and again, in terms of effective engagement, so feeling that sense of well-being and connection, alongside using videos from others. So, for example, videos on YouTube and videos on other platforms such as BBC Bitesize here in the UK. Particular challenges were the lack of student attendance in live lessons that was reported. And again, of course, that was reported more often in high-income countries. Decreased opportunities for interaction. Unexpected changes to the school day, where students had expected it to go one way, but then had to cope with multiple things changing throughout the day. Fewer opportunities for students to ask questions of their teachers, and also reduced feedback was something that was reported a lot in a variety of studies. Students also found sometimes that written explanations from their teachers was unclear. And on the flip side of that, where teachers recorded their feedback to students, there was heightened engagement found. The volume of work that was assigned by teachers was also found to be really quite overwhelming, and distractions in the home environment also impeded students on occasion. So what do all of these reviews mean for practice? Well, if we look at it in terms of the bioecological framework, in terms of the macro system, a greater awareness of the digital divide that still exists even in high-income countries is incredibly important. And that's true not just of students at K-12 level, but also students in higher education. It's recommended that government policies take more account of the need for heightened professional development time that's needed, and that may need to be reflected in the amount of time that teachers are expected to be teaching in the classroom, so contact time. At the exosystem level, greater support is needed for teachers at the institutional level, especially in terms of the staffing policy, but also funding and the professional development policy. I think greater awareness is needed of the amount of time it takes to create some of these resources, and that should be reflected in institutional policies. It's also suggested that there be, at the schooling level, increased opportunities for teachers and parents to conduct professional development together, so that there's more opportunity for, joint understanding of these approaches, but also a feeling that, we're all in this together, and that not everyone has the answers. It's also really important if you're in a secondary school that you consider the knowledge and skills that students are bringing from primary school as they come up to secondary school. And that's really important. You cannot assume necessarily that students come to you with the same level of technology skill and knowledge that students perhaps from another school might come to you with. And that's the same with higher education as well. All of the students, are being exposed to different levels of technology in their schooling, and so you can't necessarily expect that they will inherently understand how to use certain software. So it's really important that they're provided with those opportunities to learn how to use it first of all before perhaps using it in their learning. In terms of the MESO system level, it's really important to consider students' socio-economic background. And so one of the ways that institutions are advised to deepen their understanding about this is to conduct a needs analysis of students to understand what it is they have access to at home and what they don't have access to. And so that then brings up ideas of perhaps providing loan equipment to students so that they're able to have access to those types of tools, but also that the learning materials are provided in multiple methods. So not just on an intranet of an institution, for example, but that it's also provided perhaps on a USB, could be provided in the cloud, could be provided on an external website as well. So multiple ways of being able to access the tasks that are required to be completed. In terms of that microsystem level, starting with teachers, it's really important that teachers engage in ongoing professional development and also consider perhaps undertaking practitioner research. So conducting research within your own classrooms, with your own students to gain a deeper understanding of what's really happening and how engagement is manifesting itself within your classroom and what approaches you could take to perhaps boost that engagement. Recording your feedback to students is also was also found really quite engaging, and so that's not necessarily just audio feedback, but also perhaps recording yourself with video as well, so that students not only hear you but also see you. In terms of technology, providing opportunities for collaborative technology tools to be used within the classroom, and also to record your own videos. Now, I know that recording yourself can be really daunting, but it has been found to be quite engaging, and students find it another way to connect with you, another way to connect with their content. And at the end of the day, students, they see you anyway normally when you're teaching. And they listen to you all the time. So seeing you on a video or hearing you on a video is really no different. And if you make a mistake, keep going. There's no need to spend extra time trying to come up with the perfect video because it's unnecessary. We make mistakes all the time whilst teaching, and our students are probably used to it. With those videos, it's really important that they are aligned to the curriculum. So it's really important that you don't assign videos from YouTube, for example, that don't match the outcomes that you're going for or the curriculum that you're currently looking at. Also, an idea is to embed quizzes within videos or within your lessons, and to ensure that there's a level of differentiation available for students. And that includes in lockdown situations. In terms of families, as I've already mentioned, providing them opportunities for professional development in blended and online learning approaches is a really great idea, and encouraging them to watch any videos that you create as well. There were also instances of online parent-teacher interviews that were happening during the pandemic, and that was also found to be absolutely vital for increasing that parent-school connection. In terms of peers for students, Interacting with peers really does require explicit instruction. And that's not just at the schooling level, that can also be at the higher education level, understanding proper social etiquette when interacting online. Opportunities to co-create resources has been found really engaging, as has peer assessment. In terms of the institutional level, it's really important that it is a whole institution approach to technology rather than just individual isolated educators or departments. And the use of push notifications, especially at that schooling level, has been found really useful in terms of connecting to parents, but also to students to alert them to work that needs to be attended to. In terms of students themselves, they also need explicit guidance in how to learn online or using blended approaches. It's also wise to include an induction period for them to get used to using new tools, new software. And again, assuming that they know how to use these things is not the way to go. Need to make sure that there is the opportunity for some explicit guidance in how to use the software you're intending to use before you start using it within your teaching. Also a good idea to scaffold routine. So in these instances of lockdown during the pandemic, assuming that students have the ability to self-regulate, the ability to manage their time effectively, has been found to be quite difficult. So scaffolding those skills is really quite vital. Also providing students with the opportunity to self-assess has been found to be really, really valuable. In terms of implications for research, it's really crucial that any research is aligned to theory and that some kind of conceptual or theoretical framework should underpin that research. It's also important that all features of study design are included in any report of empirical research that's being conducted. So, for example, please make sure that you report on the context completely. And also, if you're using context-specific terminology, that you explain that. You can't always assume that someone will understand what a sophomore means, for example, within another context. Stronger links are needed between schools, educators, and higher education institutions. And further research is suggested at both levels of education in non-STEM areas. STEM has been found to be quite highly researched, and so other areas outside of STEM are suggested, as are research being conducted at postgraduate level as well as in the primary schooling level. So I'd like to now invite you to ponder some questions. And these are some of the things that we would have discussed had we been able to conduct this webinar in person or at least online synchronously. So things that I'd like you to consider that perhaps we might discuss then in late September are, number one, based on your experiences, is there anything in the framework that you think is missing? This is not a final framework. It's not, an exhaustive collection or ideas. This is purely what's been conducted so far, what's been collected so far, and I am really interested to hear if you think there's something in particular that is missing, either from that bioecological model or indeed from the facets of engagement as well. In fact, speaking of that, I'd also like to hear if you think there are some facets of engagement that are in the wrong domain, because there's been much discussion over some of them in particular as to whether they're cognitive engagement facet or behavioural. Question 2. What were the most influential factors on student engagement during the pandemic for your students? And if there were, in particular, what changes did you make in response, if you did? Question 3, what changes do you think are needed to pre- and in-service teacher training in regards to digital technology? And 4, how would you use this framework and the engagement-disengagement indicators to inform your teaching and or your research? I'd love to hear some of your ideas. Okay, I have some further information available to you here, and I'll probably also add a few more before I send a copy of the slides through. Please feel free to have a look at the systematic reviews that we've been doing. Have a look at some of those interactive evidence gap maps, because they're a fascinating and really accessible way for people to be able to share their results, but also to explore some of those research gaps that have been identified. We've also got further information about the systematic review project that we did on secondary schooling during the pandemic, as well as an interactive web database of all of the included studies, which takes those interactive evidence gap maps to the next level. Also have some information there about how you could sign up for a free trial of EpiReviewer, which is the systematic software that I used and that I'm also a support officer for, as well as information on how you could create an interactive evidence gap map as well. As always, I would very much welcome the opportunity to hear from you. If you would like to connect with me in any way, shape or form, please do so. There are the links there and references there for you to be able to have a look at a later date. Thank you so very much for joining me. And again, I really apologise for not being able to present on the day that I was meant to. It has been an absolute delight. Thank you very much to Francisca for inviting me. And I very much look forward to the opportunity to talk with you in late September. Okay, take care.